Greetings and welcome back. I am talking today once again to CS about a very interesting and important topic, namely cancer and the general topic of medical ignorance. Now, Clive here is both a cancer survivor and expert. That is, he survived colorectal, I believe it was.
Yes, colorectal cancer.
And he's directly involved, I believe, in cancer pharmacology, or at least in a business sense, yes?
Yes, I work in the pharmaceutical industry, so my agency, we do about 70% of our work in the oncology, whether that's solid tumors or hematological malignancies.
All right, so what we're going to talk about today is, in a medical sense, in a health sense, unnecessarily controversial, because there's solid evidence to suggest that traditional approaches to treating and indeed analyzing what cancer is are just wrong. And we're going to get into that in a bit. But first, I'd like Clive just to sort of narrate his tale, because surviving cancer is not an easy thing. And he went about it through a very different route than a conventional route. And I think it's one that is admirable, because it really shows a personal initiative as well as the desire for personal knowledge and trying to understand things yourself rather than relying entirely on other people. So Clive, I'll just let you have it.
Sure. Okay. So in 2009, I was diagnosed with an invasive carcinoma of the colon. So for about a year before this time, I was really, really unwell, passing lots and lots of blood in my stool. I had a lot of difficulty eating. I'd lost probably about 30% of my body weight. I was really, really thin at the time. And then I finally got my diagnosis after about a year of trying to persuade my GP in the UK to refer me to a specialist, because I knew I was pretty unwell at the time, but she just didn't take me very seriously. And over in the UK, over here in the healthcare system, getting a referral is a huge, huge challenge sometimes, and it was in my particular situation. So I was about 27 at the time, and it's very, very rare for somebody under the age of 60 to have a colorectal carcinoma, which is probably why she didn't want to refer me. I mean, she just couldn't believe that, hey, a 27-year-old could get this kind of cancer. It's an older person's cancer for a couple of reasons. So then I realized, okay, look, if I stayed in the UK, it's going to be very, very difficult to get the care that I need and the time that I want to have care very, very quickly. So I ended up actually traveling to the Philippines out there. This was before I then moved to the Philippines to live. And I privately went to see a gastroenterologist at one of their major medical centers over there, so I could pay privately. And he then, took a look at me. He got the colonoscopy going, and saw a pretty huge tumor that they then got the tumor out. So I had one round of surgery. It was certainly an invasive carcinoma of the colon, and the issue that I had at the time after the first round of surgery was that the margins weren't clear. So they tried to remove as much of the tumor as possible, but there was still tumor within my colon wall. So then after a couple of months, I had to go in for another round of surgery. And colon surgery isn't an easy thing. So the surgery is difficult, but it's the months or possibly even years after that a lot of people have of just incredibly I guess poor quality of life. It's very, very difficult to use the toilet in any kind of meaningful way. It's incredibly painful. So he said, look, okay, you need another round of surgery. I had the second round of surgery. The margins weren't clear again. So, and again, an invasive carcinoma is a true cancer. It's aggressive. It's very, very invasive. It goes deep into the colon walls when it's a colon cancer, and there's a very, very high likelihood that you're going to have metastases to the liver. And by the second round of surgery, I had an abdominal CT, so I already had what was suspected lung involvement as well. So things weren't looking good at this stage. So then my gastroenterologist sent me down and he said, look, I'm going to. Surgery is not going to obviously provide you a cure with this particular situation. We've had 2 rounds. and the margins still aren't clear. So what I would recommend is that you have a colostomy. And I said, no way. The first thing that came out of my mouth. And then he said, well, in addition to the colostomy, I'm going to obviously recommend chemotherapy. He said, since this seemed like a kind of localized cancer initially, surgery was the route to take, but now, you're going to need some kind of a systemic therapy, and chemotherapy is what I'm recommending. And he kind of pulled out his, notebook and was already penciling me in to see his colleague who was who was going to perform the colostomy and start, I guess, having a dialogue about which chemotherapy I was going to be taking. So I said, look, I'm a young guy, and there's no way, shape, or form I'm going to just make this decision straight away. So what I then did was I went home, and thankfully we all have the internet and YouTube, and I spent about 2 weeks doing a lot of research. Why do people get cancer? Why did I get cancer? What is cancer? Although I've always worked in the pharmaceutical industry, and I've always had a special interest in oncology, my knowledge wasn't deep because, of course, I needed to be able to have knowledge for my job as opposed to having knowledge to keep me alive. So I did a lot of research. And then I started to understand a couple of things about cancer which went against the orthodoxy in the industry. So in the industry, we'd always, I guess the belief, which drives all of the policy, how the oncologist treats you, is that cancer is a genetic disorder, as it were. So in some way, shape, or form, there are certain instructions that all cells get that they stop obeying that instruction to have, pre-programmed death, apoptosis, and trying to go pre-programmed death. But the cause of this is an issue with our genes. But this body of research, which was very, very credible, was actually saying, well, cancer is an issue with, that stems primarily from things like the diet, and it impacts your metabolic system. And then, again, further research, I found this to be conclusively, accurate, that there were multiple Nobel Prize winners. Otto, I've forgotten his name. He won the Nobel Prize for showing that, for example, cancers can't survive in the presence of vitamin C, and that they're anaerobic, so they have very, very low oxygen environment. So this stuff was pretty mind blowing to me. So I said, look, I work in the pharmaceutical industry, and most of my clients market oncology compounds on the market, and I publish their data for them. So I know that under no circumstances do I want any of these substances within my body. I've read all of their side effects, and and I work with this data on a daily basis. I really don't want to be a statistic, here. So then I started looking. Okay, now I understand what is the root cause of cancer, what can be done about it, and I started to come across a number of natural therapies. And I read a lot of case studies online where people had used these therapies very, very successfully. And most importantly for me was not only having a cure, because for sure chemotherapy kills cancer. That isn't debated. It's what it
also kills human beings.
Precisely. It's what it does to the rest of the human being. And for me, because I was very, very young, I thought, well, it's not just important to kill the cancer, but also that I come out of this with a good quality of life. I want to be able to go out, I want to be able to party, I want to be able to travel, I don't want to have to do that with a colostomy bag. So then I came across a number of therapies, and one of them was vitamin C therapy, which is chemotherapeutic to cancer above a certain plasma concentration level. So when I read up about vitamin C and all of the experiments that have been performed in humans and rats and mice, I realized, okay, this was a therapy for me. And then
this was done intravenously, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, so what then happened was, at the time I was kind of living in between the UK and the Philippines. So I'd had a place over here, and I would just fly back every month because my girlfriend, who then later became my wife, was still here. So then I thought, okay, well, this is great. I'll just have some vitamin C. Well, the issue is that vitamin C is illegal to prescribe to people intravenously for the purposes of killing cancer. So I thought, okay, well, that's really, really odd, because all of these people are getting results from this. And then of course there are a couple of other things. So vitamin C, ozone therapy, which is also illegal to use. And my research then led me to a gentleman in Canada at the time who was he was an oncologist and a naturopath over there. And he had one of the few centers in the world where I could actually get this stuff. And he had a lot of experience with many, many patients with different types of cancer. So I flew over there. I ended up living in Canada for a couple of months. And he then gave me, again, as you pointed out, mega doses of vitamin C. My tumor markers disappeared. I had the CEA32, CEA markers, that they completely just vanished. And then I had, of course, the intravenous ozone therapy where they would take out some of my blood. They would mix it with, ozone so it would become heavily oxygenated and bright pink. They would return it to my body. And just as importantly, my diet completely changed.
Yeah, that's how I stumbled. I mean, for years, as many of you know the audience, I've always been, well, always, but for the better part of a decade plus, I've been interested in, intensely so, in nutrition. And of course, by dint of that, as a consequence, then health and disease and the effects that nutrition can have on disease. And sure. I think it's really important you mentioned, getting back to that cancer cells universally are anaerobic, have an anaerobic metabolism. Now, what this means, for those of you who are unfamiliar, the difference between anaerobic and aerobic is simply that anything that has an anaerobic metabolism requires glucose to function. Now, human beings, when you're exercising, it's no different. I mean, if you're engaged in strenuous, sort of fast, power-related exercises like cleaning and jerking in the gym, or basically any sort of heavy weight intensity, hill sprints, things like that, you're going to require glucose, that is glycogen, to do those things. Aerobic, of course, refers to having the presence of oxygen, and you can actually then use fat, lipids as an energy source. Unlike the human body, in a general sense, cancer cells absolutely, universally, without exception, there's no exception that we know of, as far as I know, of any kind of cancer, that always requires glucose. And with every cell in the human body can run off of lipids and ketones. That's not true of cancer. So having explained that a bit, maybe you can tell us about what you had done diet-wise.
Sure thing. So my naturopath and oncologist at the time, he put me on a very, very specific diet, which was a raw green diet. So if it's green, you can eat it pretty much, and it has to be raw. So every once in a while, possibly, once every 2 days or something, I could incorporate something cooked in there. So a tiny bit of rice or a tiny bit of some kind of a cooked vegetable. But it was pretty much, salads and nuts. So a big salad with nuts for breakfast, a big salad with nuts for lunch, and a big salad with nuts for dinner. If I felt hungry, a big salad with nuts. So it was just lots of nuts, lots of greens. And I felt fantastic. I felt absolutely fantastic. And compared with a lot of individuals who were diagnosed, at the same time as myself with my gastroenterologist, I'm actually one of the few who's still alive. Because they underwent the chemotherapy and they just didn't make it through. So the diet played an incredibly important role because of the fact
you're depriving the cancer cells of excessive glucose.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is unfortunately controversial. It shouldn't be. I mean, cancer cells require glucose, so it stands to reason any diet which severely restricts carbohydrates, and your diet or say a ketogenic diet, where you have say 30 or even 50 grams or less in some cases, that's going to be detrimental to the fermentation process of cancer cells. And the claim, as far as I've observed and read and seen in the medical community, that this requires more, established trials and what have you. But I think when it comes down to it, your situation illustrates this rather perfectly. If it's a matter of life or death, you're not going to care about clinical trials. Yeah. I mean, this is just a matter, if I were to, the gods forbid, come down with cancer, well, at the moment, I'm pretty ketogenic anyway. I don't think I would have to change too much of my diet for the most part. because all I pretty much eat are greens, meat, fish, and a bit of nuts and what have you. Anyway, but I would certainly look into other options. You use whatever you have at your disposal,
Certainly.
and I think you point this out privately, and it's an excellent observation that most people just look to doctors as sort of fixer-uppers.
Yes.
And in some regard, that's true. As you point out, if you're broken, whatever, like my hernia in early 2014, I mean, you need to go to a doctor.
Yes.
Because if they don't plug it up and put a mesh, your intestines could literally leak out, and I had this huge bump in my groin area, and they fixed me. Doctors are great for that sort of thing. But when it comes to understanding complex metabolic issues, anything, I mean, I mentioned this before, there are three things I think doctors are good for: pushing or prescribing pills, plugging stuff up or fixing it, broken bones, hernias, and occasionally removing things like tumors, like my benign mandibular salivary tumor.
Certainly.
that I had removed in I think it was early 2012. Beyond that, I use the motto "Doctor, heal thyself."
Absolutely.
They become, I think, overly specialized, and like anyone in any field, but they lack the kind of general knowledge about the human body and metabolism that really is essential. And
they're not basic scientists, and that's where I guess we as members of the public often assume that the doctor is not only a clinician but a basic scientist as well. And these are very, very different things.
No, they're I mean, I call them, they're pill pushers, basically, or they you get when I went to the ears, mouth and nose doctor for my mandibular tumor, he saw it, he had experience, he referred me, and 2-3 weeks later I got the surgery. Okay, but this is, it's a job like anyone. It's like a guy who spends all day notarizing stuff. They're not all of them universally, but most of them are not interested in the specific details of metabolism, and which plays such a huge role in disease and disease control and containment, and it's really a shame. And the fact that this is what we're talking about is regarded as controversial, when the facts and the science are behind us. There's no, no doctor is going to say, no, cancer doesn't need glucose or something like that. And as you pointed out as well, privately, there are very few diseases that have a treatment that can potentially kill you, and cancer is one of them. It's just universally, whether it's in Germany, the UK, United States, just let's irradiate the hell out of you.
Exactly. Well, I think you're completely right there. That within oncology, we tolerate, I guess, a side effect profile that in other therapeutic areas we would consider to be insane. Absolutely insane. So for example, we tolerate that if we give somebody, something to help them manage their cancer, that, 30 to 40% of them will die very, very quickly of the side effects of the chemotherapy, whether that's through anemia, so the red blood cell loss, the aspergillosis because their immune system has just been absolutely destroyed, the white blood cell loss at a neutropenia, and even without the death, the quality of life that we're prepared to put up with in a cancer patient and another therapy, it would be considered to be absolutely asinine.
It's a level, I think, of medical. I won't call it scientific, because the science, we know where the science stands as far as cancer metabolism goes, and it's a kind of medical stagnation that for, it seems like decades now, people have been stuck with. We're gonna A-bomb your ass, essentially. We're gonna just irradiate you, and this is the solution. And no one really considering metabolic therapies, some of intravenous vitamin C, some of the things you mentioned. I hadn't been aware of the vitamin C thing, for example. The metabolic stuff, specifically with glucose deprivation, I had been. I'm not a conspiracy nut, as all of you know, but sometimes things come down to the bottom line. If, in fact, some of the therapies you mentioned, specifically change in diet, could be used to treat or at least contain cancer, that's a hell of a lot cheaper than the drugs and the irradiation.
Certainly.
And I think that might be part of it. It's playing a role.
It most certainly does. And I think you kind of labeled it pretty well the other day, that it's a bottom line thinking, and that does certainly play a role. What also plays a role within cancer care and why we're not able to move forward as quickly is a kind of ethics committee. So let's say, for example, you and I were credentialed in the area of cancer medicine. We wanted to put together a study looking at, a low glucose diet, so a ketogenic diet, or vitamin C, or sodium ascorbate. It's just some of the known things that have been used to deal with cancer in individual patients. And we said, okay, well, we hypothesize this can benefit a lot of patients, so that let's put together a randomized placebo-controlled clinical trial, which is the gold standard. Now, such a trial wouldn't get past the ethics boards. They would say, look, these patients, they have to have chemotherapy. So what would likely happen is they would say, okay, look, you can give a ketogenic diet in addition to chemotherapy. But actually, what we know is that chemotherapy destroys things. So whatever benefits we're getting from the ketogenic diet are going to be offset by the chemotherapy, which is ravishing the person's body, killing cells, and just flooding their liver, essentially. So half of it is for sure the bottom line thinking, and half of it is also an
dogma.
Exactly. And sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking that we often look. I mean, we as lay people, as medicine is a sort of branch of science or an extension of science. There's scientific research done usually by PhDs or what have you, and then it goes into medicine. And over the past decades, I think, there are two major diseases, I think, that have been victims of essentially medical dogma. Yeah. One is cancer in all of its forms, obviously, because we've been talking about the poisonous and destructive nature of radiation therapy. The other is arteriosclerosis and heart disease.
Oh, yes.
I wanted to talk about because it's relevant. This is people for decades had been subject to just a litany of medical dogma about the nature of certain kinds of lipids, specifically saturated fats, that have no basis in reality whatsoever. And for example, the claim that saturated fat is linked causatively to elevated LDL cholesterol or a bad lipid there's no evidence for it. And I think once people get something in their head, and let's be honest, there's a political aspect to this. When something becomes politicized, mainstream, and then we can call chemotherapy as something mainstream. We can call the lipid hypothesis, the nonsense about saturated fat and what have you, as mainstream. People are very unwilling to retract that. Yeah. And the problem with this, it's okay to be dogmatic. I mean, I'm not saying it's okay. I'm using air quotes here. It's okay to be dogmatic about, something silly. If you're dogmatic about your, I don't know,
sports team,
Madrid, Barcelona, okay, that's fine. I might not be interested. The problem with medical dogmatism is it's getting people killed.
Yeah.
And it's fed through this tube of ignorance. And we're just starting, at least, I mean, I'm more familiar with the coronary stuff than I am with cancer, to be honest. But we're just kind of slowly getting over that.
For sure.
It's not quite as controversial, to the best of my knowledge, to say that, saturated fat is not only not bad, it has some positive health benefits.
Oh, yes. In fact, since we adopted the low-fat diet, I call it the low-fat, high-grain diet. They said
starch diet.
Exactly. You've got to eat a lot of grains, and that's got to form the basis of your kind of nutrition, and then very, very low fat. And the rates of obesity and heart disease have just gone through the roof.
Yeah.
The rates of diabetes have gone through the roof as a result.
So well said. In the early 20th century, particularly in the United States, people would constantly cook with butter and specifically lard.
Exactly.
It doesn't get more saturated than that. There were much lower, there were other health issues. It was, more primitive. There were much lower rates of heart disease and heart attacks and all the associated coronary problems and during that era than the subsequent decades when the quote-unquote low-fat, high-sugar, high-starch diet was recommended. And I do plan on folks making a specific video about the lipid hypothesis, but to really give a quick summary, because we don't have time to go into all the details, a guy named Ansel Keys in the 1950s conducted a very poorly done study that supposedly linked consumption of saturated fat in certain populations with heart disease. Subsequently, it's been debunked. There's really no evidence, but he got government backing for this, and then it kind of seeped into the medical community. And long story short, the lipid hypothesis was born, and it's a testable hypothesis that's been debunked.
Oh, yes, certainly.
We don't know the exact details, but most people's, including my own, lipid profiles and HDL, LDL, cholesterol ratios improve when they go low-carb or ketogenic, whereas I've had shitty lipid profiles, frankly speaking, when I'm just eating like, John Smith, normal guy. This has been extremely damaging. I think you can see the problem here. I think you can say unilaterally an absolute sort of declarative statement that sugar is just bad for you. It's not good. It's terrible for cancer.
Yes.
You mentioned some stories of people coming to you looking for advice and some consulting because you'd survived. You said, you need to get off the sugar. And they don't do it, and they end up dying.
Yes, absolutely. I have that all the time because of the networks that I move in. Most of them know that I'm a cancer survivor, and because so many people are now, being diagnosed with cancer these days, I get probably about 3 or 4 of these every single month, where it's somebody that I know and it's a family member or a very, very close friend, and they'll say, "Look, go to Clive. He's a cancer survivor, and like yourself, he didn't." He's not keen on chemotherapy. So, but then I'll take some time on my schedule. I'll sit down with this person. I'll explain to them in depth what I did, who I went to. I'll give them names, addresses, and explain to them, look, the most important thing for you to do now is to get off the sugar in all of its forms. Get off the sugar, including fruits as well.
Absolutely.
That's essential. Get off it. Get off any sugars. And if possible, even if you do decide to go down the chemotherapy route, adopt a green raw diet, at least for the duration of your care. And often, actually, a lot of the pushback comes from their healthcare professionals. So what will usually happen is they'll say, okay, this sounds great, and then they'll go to maybe their hematologist or their oncologist, and they'll say, look, I know this guy, and he said, he survived cancer, and he recommended I adopt a raw green diet. And the healthcare professional will then talk them out of it. They'll say, look, you need to get your calories from somewhere, and I'm not...
Well, nuts are calorie bombs or fat calories. I know.
Exactly.
I can't even control my nuts. I tend to, when I'm keto, I tend to not even try nuts, not because it throws me out of ketosis, it's just because I can easily pack away 100 grams. In the case of Brazil nuts, that's close to 700 calories.
Exactly. So. They're incredibly calorifically dense. And then the oncologist or the hematologist or their surgeon will then talk them out of this. And in about half of the cases, I'll, then meet with the individual, or I'll have a chat with the individual who kind of referred them to me to say, look, have a chat with, with Clive. And he died or she died. And it's very disheartening because a high quality health is just, it's very, very close. You cut out the sugars, particularly in times where the body has formed a tumor, because of the way tumors form. And I'll explain a lot of the science to them and just say, look, your body undergoes a very, very specific process when it forms a tumor. And tumors have very, very specific characteristics in that they have very, very low levels of oxygen. Again, we mentioned earlier that they're anaerobic, and they produce energy by a kind of high rate of glycosis followed by lactic acid fermentation. Because it's such an inefficient process, it just consumes vast amounts of glucose. So the most important thing you can do is to remove
starve it of glucose.
Exactly, and not starve your body, because your body is still getting all of your nutrients from spinach, broccoli, all of your greens. So you're going to be well fed, but you certainly and absolutely should not be consuming sugars, because again, the research has shown that this will ensure that the cancer is far more aggressive, and at least.
I am curious about one thing.
Sure.
You didn't mention meat or fish. Generally speaking, as long as you don't overconsume these proteins, they're in a traditional ketogenic diet, they're fine. I mean, they're kind of a staple.
Certainly.
Moderate protein. I imagine you cut out animal products as well.
I did. That could have been more about the personal beliefs of the individual who he doesn't eat meat, so he then
yeah. Well, it is true. I mean, a lot of people don't know that the reason why if you're ketogenic, you really need to moderate the protein is because over a certain threshold, your body loves glucose. Not just it's actually alcohol is actually preferred over glucose, but that's a separate issue. But if you take in too much protein, much of that, upwards of 40% is going to be through gluconeogenesis. The proteins are going to be converted to glucose, and that's not what you want. I mean, over the years, I made this mistake all the time. I overconsume protein. I've really tried to keep it pretty low. I try to smaller quantities of meat, but it seems to me that a lot of these people, and this is this problem, they look at doctors as fixer-uppers, and they don't want to take the time and the energy to really have the energy to say, look, I'm going to do the research for myself. This is willing to do it. What do you have to lose? I mean, a couple of months of missing out on some stuff. I mean, it's not a big deal, and the possible benefits that you reap, surviving a deadly disease, seem to me well worth it.
Certainly.
But a lot of this, I'm convinced, and I'm just speculating here, that it seems in every area of major health concern, be it cancer or coronary problems or diabetes, rather obvious, sugar is the major culprit.
Certainly.
Not in particular overconsumption, but consumption in general. If I'm at the supermarket, I'll usually buy when I do ketogenic, I eat a fair amount of greens. I need the fiber, spinach, broccoli, whatever, the leaves for salads. And then I'll mix the meat and fish in it, and what have you. So I usually buy my greens in bulk if it's possible, and I'll stand in the queue, and I see the person behind me and in front of me, and I like to observe, and I see the things they're getting. High starch products, sugary products, not just junk food, but quote unquote bread. Even whole grain bread.
It's all refined. It's all refined, isn't it?
Refined carbohydrates, and I kind of it occurs to me that I'm a bit of a freak in that, one, I know about this stuff, and I don't think this is an extraordinary feat. It's hardly, you don't need to be possessed of particular intelligence to know this stuff. And the fact that I'm actually paying attention to this, and every time I stand in the queue at a supermarket, I see, and I can just walk through the street and see what people eat for breakfast. I mean, these kind of refined starches like white bread, and even in my neighborhood, and there's a chain in Germany called the Backwerk, literally the baking work. You can imagine what it means. You go there. The only thing I get there is coffee, and I'll sometimes put a bit of cream in. That's it. But it's just pastries, croissants, mostly white stuff, bagel.
And Nussschnecke, I would have loved.
Yeah, and the Nussschnecke. Well, not familiar with that one. There's another one that opened up recently called Zeit für Brot, which is literally time for bread, and all they have are different kinds of bread. I mean, bread. I think first off, it's processed, and people think bread is this great thing.
It's terrible for the body.
It's just bad. It tends to be not. It's not even particularly nutrient dense. There are some varieties with certain kinds of grains, but most of it is just crap. And I see people just eating for their breakfast. I mean, people sometimes I'll get in a conversation. So, what did you have for breakfast? I can tell you what I had breakfast today. I had about 150 grams of beef, of steak. 75 grams of spinach, and about 100 grams of a chopped up bell pepper, in an olive oil and a bit of vinegar, and that was my breakfast, And I guess to most people that's unimaginable, and I'm not. But I look at what they eat. It's bread.
Particularly, so I lived in Germany as well, and you would have maybe some kind of
most bread varieties in the world, Mike.
Oh yeah, but bread for breakfast, and then bread with the meal for lunch, and then some kind of a bread with a spread for dinner as well.
I remember years ago, one of my exes. They'd have you'd have like cold cuts, bit of salamis and stuff, put on bread with butter, and
that stuff is lethal.
Absolutely. This is something we can talk about as well. Combining high fat and high carbohydrates really bad, but the consumption of starch in general, and particularly the overconsumption of starch and sugar. And sugar really doesn't. Anyone who's been ketogenic for a while, and if you ever kind of tried like a carb up thing, and some people, it's disputed whether this is beneficial or not as far as say sports performance is concerned. But the fog you enter in, it's a serotonin bomb. Yeah. I don't usually take naps because I can't during the day. If I go, even without being just a high carb meal, I can knock myself out. It's incredible. But the problem is just it's standard fare, and people think it's absolutely acceptable to eat this stuff when it should be a treat. Having a bowl of spaghetti and tomato sauce should be like a once a month thing, not a fucking every other day,
for sure.
Every day, several to pasta. Pasta is something that there are a couple of exceptions. Most people don't metabolize well, and most people don't get much benefit out of. And but it's standard fare. It's cheap. I know you buy some spaghetti at the supermarket, you boil it. Tin fish is pretty cheap too, and the amount of you'd have to eat to get mercury poisoning is pretty vast. So you don't have to worry. But things like mackerel, sardines is pretty cheap, and it's far better for your health than something like refined spaghetti or whatever.
Most certainly, and I also think it's down to the way we're educated about drugs, diseases, and food. One of the things I'm always very, very keen to really point out is this: when you have a metabolic disease, which the research clearly indicates that cancer is a metabolic disease. Metabolic diseases aren't cured, so to speak, through drugs or mechanical manipulation or some kind of a surgical intervention. It's always through the diet. If it's a metabolic issue, it's always going to be due to down to the fuel source that you give your body. For sure, I guess over the last 50 years in Western society, we've been educated pretty consistently that the basis of a healthy diet is grains
and starches.
Exactly, and grains are absolutely they age you because your body converts this into alcohol.
Well, it's interesting. There's historical evidence. I've read several books and articles on this that it's kind of, they don't call it this. I call it the kind of the grain paradox, that as agriculture was introduced to human civilization, people's health degraded. But because it was able to be mass produced, it did kind of compensate. So there are a lot of cases of caries or cavities, tooth decay, in places like ancient Egypt, and when overconsumption of honey, grains and what have you, that were absent in hunter-gatherer societies where they essentially had a much healthier diet. So grain has been a great paradox, and it seems that ethnically, metabolically speaking, the further away your origins are as a person from the introduction of grain and agriculture, the worse you tend to deal with grain metabolically. You see this in the UK. With most, quote unquote, native Britons. They have the rates of heart disease, common things. People, admittedly from the Mediterranean area, the Middle East, tend to deal with grains somewhat better.
For sure.
And of course, you have people in, say, the Far East that eat rice all the time. These people have a certain, I think, genetic advantage in this regard. But even so, the overconsumption of starches is just absolutely lethal.
Certainly.
And I mean, if I were a perfect human being, perfectly disciplined, I would never have it. But there are times when, I just need to go on a binge, I guess. But the science is out there now.
Certainly.
We know this. We know, for example, that cancer is a metabolic disease. We know that excessive starch and sugar consumption leads to diabetes. We know that it fuels cancer. It hasn't been studied, it should be, but we know that the high sugar, low fat diet has it seems led to increased incidence of heart disease and heart related death.
And diabetes in its complete.
Diabetes is a no brainer.
Yeah.
I mean, the way diabetes, for those of you who aren't, this is obvious to anyone who knows anything. So every time you consume a carbohydrate, the pancreas then reacts to that because your blood sugar levels go up by secreting insulin. Insulin brings the blood sugar levels back down. Now, what if you're bombarding your body constantly with excessive amounts of carbohydrates, as in day in and day out, like anything, you can kind of, your organs receive wear and tear. Your pancreas becomes less and less responsive, meaning it produces less and less insulin. And you lose what's called insulin sensitivity. You can, if you keep it up, and you basically deaden your pancreas to the point where it no longer produces insulin, that's when you have diabetes. And there are two kinds of diabetes. There's type 1, which is pretty much genetic, but it's the same thing. Adult onset diabetes and type diabetes mellitus 2 is something that people usually do to themselves. Because they burn out their pancreas. Basically, they're constantly stimulating themselves with carbohydrates, and once you get to that point, it becomes very, very difficult to control without insulin, external insulin, which tends to be pig insulin. So very, very close. It's basically the same as human insulin. People inject it to compensate.
I mean, there are now substances that work. For example, you have the DPP-4 inhibitor, the SGL2 inhibitors, that work through a slightly different mechanism. But for example, I mean, just to kind of also reconfirm what you're saying, the first-line treatments in the management of type 2 diabetes is usually always a dietary change, very specifically, carbohydrate reduction. And
I mean, there's cases where mild cases of diabetes type 2 have been completely addressed through a ketogenic diet, for example.
Absolutely. In fact, that's the ideal. And if you do,
you want good insulin sensitivity. I mean, you want.
Oh yes.
When you, let's say you're going to carb up or you're engaging in some athletic thing, you want your liver to be filled, but most importantly, glucose can't be used directly. It needs to be converted to what's called glycogen, muscle glycogen. You want you want your muscles to be able to absorb as much as possible and as effectively as possible. The less frequently you consume carbohydrates, the hungrier the muscles become for glycogen, and so they become much more effective and much more insulin sensitive to consume carbohydrates than if you're constantly bombarding them with glucose. So the science is it's out there. It's available to anyone who has the internet. The internet's pretty cheap these days, and people who want to understand this stuff. But a lot of it is just convenience. I've fallen off the bandwagon sometimes, and I just eat crap or pizza. It happens, and I do so, of course, consciously, knowing how terrible it is. Once in a blue moon, it's okay. But the point we've been trying to make is this stuff should be, exceptional in the sense that you should only eat it as an exception. Yes. Pizza shouldn't be standard fare. Pasta and bread shouldn't be standard fare.
Exactly.
Bagel shouldn't be standard fare.
Soda,
soda. I haven't drunk soda and fruit juice as well is terrible.
Oh, yeah.
When I was a kid, when I was a teenager, I got very close to being obese, basically, because of the dogma of low fat, high sugar. I would see products like fruit juice. Oh, it's all natural. It's squeezed directly from oranges, and think I can drink a lot of this. And so I would drink orange juice by the cartons, and big surprise, I blew up.
That's really bad for you. Again, your body recognizes, because it's fructose. So
Yeah. Well, fructose, of course, follows a different. I don't want to. I may make a video about this. A different chemical pathway. Your body isn't as efficient at metabolizing fructose as is glucose. So, but yeah, I mean, it's fructose. It's more complicated for your body to deal with. But even things like, the ultra low fat cookies, and then think, oh wow, this meant, and I was metabolically ignorant at the time, this means I can eat lots of cookies, right? And I spent years trying to pick up after that and trying to fix my body because of just the dogma that had been, I imagine, in a world that hadn't been susceptible or hadn't fallen under the sway of this sort of lipid hypothesis, high sugar dogma, I might have just automatically led a healthier life as a younger person because, I might have still been metabolically, scientifically ignorant, but the wisdom of the day wouldn't have been, low fat, high carb.
Certainly, and I guess the products available within your vicinity.
Yeah, absolutely.
That they play a huge role. And what I'm beginning to see, and I believe you're beginning to see the same thing, is that parts of what we consider to be medical care or health care, as it were, is driven by an ideology that isn't supported by the basic science. And this kind of huge disconnect is really very, very harmful. So, for example, in the area of lipidology, the idea that, for example, if you eat beef tallow or lard, nowadays it's very, very difficult to even find this stuff. So for example, the other day I went to my local butcher's and I said, hey, look, do you have any lard you can sell me? And he kind of looked at me and said, well, nobody buys that stuff anymore. I thought, well, have you noticed everybody's really, really overweight? I mean, you need butter and,
butter is, I mean, when I try to do I don't know how, they claim it's 90% grass-fed, the Kerry Gold kind. When I cook, I usually use butter, and I even use it on a spread on vegetables, I'll put it on broccoli and, because you need the high fat on ketogenic, and butter is a great source for that.
Most certainly. So these ideologies drive a lot of policy. As children in the public schools, people are simply fed incredibly high amounts of carbohydrates. So then this forms a kind of normative eating pattern as they grow up.
You see diabetes taking hold of relatively young children.
Certainly.
And usually it's in conjunction with being overweight or obesity because, as many of you know, when you not only can you deaden your pancreas and decrease insulin sensitivity, but there are limits. I mean, an untrained person with no athletic kid probably has a limit of only a few hundred carbs at most, and then everything beyond that is converted to fat. I mean, I'm not going to get into too much of the details. It's not. There are law of thermodynamics, technical law of thermodynamics. True, yeah. You need calories. If you eat surplus, you gain weight. True, but it's not just calories in and out.
Yeah.
How the body metabolizes different macronutrients is essential.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, for most people, it's a lot easier to get fat on eating too many carbs than eating lots of fat. It's pretty hard to do that, to eat so much fat. I mean, I've never managed it where you actually put on weight.
Certainly. Well, the kind of dogma is that a calorie is a calorie is a calorie, and that's completely inaccurate.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the vaguest sense, I mean, once again, if you eat too many calories, yes, you will gain weight. And if you're not in a deficit, no, you will not lose weight. That is true. But that doesn't tell you half the story about how individual types of calories and metabolism. I mentioned alcohol previously. Now, alcohol is an interesting molecule because it's somewhat in between carbohydrates and fats, about 7 calories per gram. Your body actually prioritizes alcohol calories over glucose, interestingly enough, when you're consuming it. And the fact that the body prioritizes different types of macronutrients, and I'm not going to necessarily consider alcohol as a macronutrient, shows you that that there's something at work here that makes these macronutrients distinct. If the body automatically prioritizes glucose over fat, that tells you something. So it's not as simple as a calorie is a calorie. How we metabolize individual calories is, and the source of those calories is really important. And this isn't a question of dogma. I mean, I'm not someone who would just think, I hereby swear by the gods of ketosis, and if you don't do well with it, there's a few people who don't, then fine. And it's hard. I miss sugar and stuff like that. But there's so many dogmatic positions that are just unamenable to reason in the public sphere. I mean, behind the curtains, guys like you and I, and people on blogs and YouTube discussions and the wider internet, people are savvy. They know that starches are bad. They know that sugar is bad. But the medical community is kind of a fossil in this. They don't really pay attention much. And you know what? That's fine. I've made my peace with doctors as pill pushers, fixers and cutters. I don't see them as people look to for metabolic medical advice. I don't see them really in I've had, in that regard, terrible experiences with doctors. As far as cutting things out and plugging things up, they've been quite good.
Oh yes, they're great. So again, if you break a bone, your healthcare professional is a lifesaver in that regard. They'll fix you.
There's nothing, you can't do it on your own. You can't fix a hernia. A hernia when the abdominal wall ruptures and your intestines leak out. You can't fix that on your own. But I'm at least pleased and somewhat hopeful that in the layperson's community, so many people are catching on to the reality of the science of metabolism. I mean, there are literally obesity clinics popping up all over, particularly in the United States. I think Texas now is the most of them. And it's not conspiratorial, but it's a fact. Food companies hire food chemists to concoct and construct specific types of food that basically stimulate the pleasure of a combination of usually high fat and sugar. And you don't want to combine high fat and high sugar. If you're going to have carbohydrates, keep it low fat. That is true. But don't combine the two. But so many foods do. I mean, you'll have like pasta with some creamy sauce, cakes. And these people are hired, these food chemists, to basically create taste bombs on your tongue. And it's been shown, and I plan on making a video, that some of this stuff dumbs down the dopamine receptors, and so you need more and more of it to get the kick out of it, than you did originally.
It becomes like a drug high.
Well, in some cases, there were several studies that show that some of these foodstuffs dumb down your dopamine response worse than cocaine in some cases.
For sure. Which is why, for example, I usually have nothing to do with supermarkets. I never go into them. I try to make sure that my food is organic and, if possible...
Well, for a man of wealth and means such as you, I do the same thing. But I do, for example, I don't make sure, but if I see that, this meat is imported from Ireland, Ireland does have a reputation usually for having grass-fed stuff, so
absolutely.
I try to go by that. I use, Kerry butter, Kerry Gold, and, and as far as fish is concerned, I can only hope for the best, but I tend to avoid, I know German products tend not to be grass-fed, so I try to avoid that.
For sure. Well, it's all of the processed foods. So every once in a while over here, let's say I have some reason to be in the, the local supermarket, and then I see people who are very, very overweight, picking up, bags of pasta and pizza and cakes. But one of the things I've realized over a period of time is that they don't actually have very much control over this process. What's happened is that, again, as you've...
No, they're addicts.
Yeah, exactly. It's essentially, see that person as an addict, and whose kind of dopamine reward system has been severely compromised. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I've been on sometimes in situations where, for ongoing periods of time, I know that I'm in a kind of sugar addiction phase. I constantly need more and more, and I think a lot of people identify with that. When you're, this amount of chocolate is enough. You need more, and then you need all these pastries, and it doesn't help. can you imagine if you're a heroin or cocaine addict, where on every corner you walk by, there's the cheap cocaine deal or whatever, whereas here, it's chocolate croissants and poppy seed pastries, and everywhere you go, it's there. And it does, I know not everyone can do it. I can do it if I really take a hold of myself, and I have for the past couple of weeks been reforming my diet back to good standards. Weight that I had gained is coming off, and that it's tough though, because you get into the sugar fix, because sugar is by far the most popular illegal drug.
Yes.
I think it's more popular than alcohol, or it's everywhere, and it's socially sanctioned. It's
that's the important thing. That's the important. It's a social sanction. It's not socially sanctioned as of yet to be blind drunk, but to just scoff down 5 cream pies. That's completely fine.
Yeah, it's considered just a normal thing. If I'm occasionally in a restaurant for breakfast, it doesn't happen very often because it tends to be expensive. What do I order? When I'm on track, I'll just order, eggs and bacon and maybe a glass of water. And I see everyone else around me. They're either combining their eggs and bacon with bread, or they're eating all kinds of, pastries. And I think you were the one. You pointed out recently that someone remarked, and I forgot who it was, that if livestock and animals in general were fed our current diet, they'd just be dead.
Exactly. It was. I took the quote from G. Edward Griffin, the research, and he pointed out, look, the kind of standard Western diet, if we fed it to the livestock industry, we would wipe out the industry and all of the livestock probably within about 6 months. Animals can't tolerate the kind of things that we feed ourselves, and for sure, it's a testament to the resilience of the human body. But
I suppose, yeah. But and sort of medical intervention as well. After all, if being a type 2 diabetic doesn't mean a death sentence. You can just get your pig insulin.
For sure.
But the notion of a bottom line, there's some real ethical concerns. Let's face it, with lobbying, particularly in the United States, Coca-Cola, for example, it's bad. You shouldn't be drinking Coca-Cola, period.
Yeah.
But Coca-Cola is never going to come out and say, guys, it's not just the high fructose corn syrup, it's sugar that's bad too, and it is bad. Yeah. They're not going to come out and say that, because there's a real conflict. There's an ethical conflict between profitability and bad health. And companies, frankly speaking, they're not run by ethical committees. They're not necessarily run by ethical people. They don't care if it's bad for you. Look at the tobacco industry. They just want to make a profit, and I get that. That's human nature. But that's why people need to become self-educated and become aware of these things, so they can move away from this. And personally, I would love to see a world where Coca-Cola went bankrupt.
Oh, same here. It's a dangerous, lethal substance, which, again, I'm just going to pull off something off the top of my head, but I would assume that we've had more deaths from Coca-Cola than, people shooting each other in the States every single year. This is a very, very destructive drug.
Absolutely. The amount of sugar. I'm not even talking about high fructose corn syrup. Sugar, particularly refined sugar, which is what goes into that. There's no discernible health benefit to it.
Exactly. Other than the fact that it just makes it highly addictive, so they can sell more of it.
Yeah. At least with fruit, and I said fructose is molecularly different to glucose. You get vitamins, you get mineral. There are benefits. Fruit in moderation is not a bad thing. In moderation,
because it's also a slightly slow release. Because so that it's not the kind of intense insulin spike that you'll see.
Yeah, it's not. And basically things that promote the famous glycemic index, which does have some value. Obviously, if you're going to still consume carbohydrates, things with a low glycemic index tend to be better.
Sweet potatoes versus regular
sweet potatoes, certain kinds of brown rice, things like that. But the stuff that's standard fare, I mean, sugar, like I said, sugar is a drug. It's really dangerous, and people don't think of it as such.
Sure.
And because they choose to essentially wallow in ignorance, and the government's not going to address this, medical healthcare professionals aren't, because they're still clinging to, mythologies of saturated fat and what have you. And it's bad for cancer. It's bad. It can make you diabetic. It's bad for heart disease. And people really need to wake up to this. I mean, you can't rely on the medical community for this. It's useless in that regard. If I want my sleep medication, I go to a doctor, he gives it to me. That's great. But you can't go to these people for dietary advice.
Agreed.
I mean, these guys are still talking about low-fat, high-carb.
Agreed. This late in the game, in spite of all of the evidence. And again, it does really, really help us kind of narrow in on the fact that your physician, whether that's a primary care physician or a rheumatologist or whatever, your physician is exactly that. He's a physician as opposed to a basic scientist who really, really understands the kind of very, very complex interaction between the body's systems. He or she understands, drug pharmacology, drug interactions, and they're usually very, very good at that. But hopefully for your own long-term health, it's, if you truly understand how the body, kind of metabolizes the fuel you give it, what fuel is beneficial to the body and what isn't, you just stand a far better chance of being in a better quality of health, of course, or all things.
And I mean, I should mention as well, this is far more recent. I've only been fasting, say, in the last year or two on an occasional basis, or ever more regularly. But the idea that we should be constantly eating this sort of 3 meals a day thing, this is also has no scientific basis to it. It's just a habit, breakfast, lunch, dinner. I tend to partition all my meals early, so I'm pretty much done by 1 o'clock in the afternoon usually. But and I plan on making a video about this as well eventually. There's so much evidence suggesting that the health of at least intermittent fasting and even more excessive fasting, a day, 2, 3, a couple of weeks ago I did a 3-day fast. I admit it's not pleasant. It doesn't feel good at the time, but there are a lot of health benefits
for sure
to it. There's just strong evidence to suggest that we had been metabolically adapted to these kinds of caloric cycling, and sometimes you have access to food and sometimes you don't. And everything we do in not just Western, but just sort of traditional society in general goes against that. You have your meal in the morning, you have your meal at night, and then you have dinner. And
snacking all the way through.
And snacking all the time. The fact that you're hungry, the fact that your body wants to eat, that's a survival adaptation.
Yeah.
That's not a signal that you necessarily should eat. Yeah. Because your body's going to tell you if it's hungry, even if you've had in some cases 3,000 calories in a day, which for most people is an excessive amount. Yeah. You're going to be, if you had your 3,000 calories in the morning and afternoon, and then at 7 p.m. at night, and I'm hungry. So if you're hungry, you should eat. That is a bad misapprehension of what hunger indicates. I mean, hunger is there to indicate that you probably should hunt. And of course, in prehistoric times, food scarcity was immense, and so hunger was a good motivator for you to do something.
Exactly.
But when you're hungry now, and you just need to head over to the supermarket to get your sausages and your bread and your chocolate bars, we've kind of lost our way, and I hate to go back to the roots, but to some extent we need to go back to our metabolic roots.
Yeah.
All the technological civilizational progress that we've made collectively has done very little to change the basic nature of our metabolism. Yeah. And its responses to this disease and how we gain fat and what have you, and it's not easy to reverse these things, but slowly you can do it. I mean, I would highly recommend people at least do intermittent fasting, And not even for losing weight necessarily. It's because there are other health benefits.
The clarity of mind.
Autophagy, when white blood cells recycle themselves, the preservation of telomere length. There's so many benefits.
Sure.
I'm not saying it's pleasant. Sometimes it's not, but there are benefits.
For sure. And before modernity, so when you felt hungry, going to capture your food, probably you're burning 2,000 or 3,000 calories just chasing the thing down. So,
probably not quite as much, but
but
definitely a whole bunch of you're engaged in strenuous activity.
Absolutely.
And you need to balance that out once you and look at traditional places. I mean, they tend to consume the high fat content, the fatty organs like liver, intestines. I mean, these were highly prized, but we. You can't live in a society that's primarily sedentary, eat tons of sugar, which is going to overload your glycogen reserves, and it's going to, get converted triglycerides, and expect that nothing bad's going to happen. And yet that is where we find ourselves in. And I find it's a shame that I caught on to this far too late in a way. I mean, I wish I'd caught on to this 25 years ago as opposed to maybe 10, 15 years ago. But it's better late than never, and particularly young people have a great opportunity to educate themselves and to really do things differently. And there's another thing that I should point out that, I mean, just because you don't put on weight, I mean, I've known skinny diabetes type 2 people. I've known people, it's possible that you just have a furnace of a metabolism, a prehistorically inefficient metabolism, and you don't really get fat. And you could still have terrible triglyceride levels and bad lipid profiles. I've seen people like this. I've met people like this. So, I think everything, the golden mean in moderation. I'm not suggesting that you should never grant yourself the pleasure of eating a piece of cake or a nice starchy bowl of pasta, but you should be really exceptional things, not every day. And you don't need to eat super expensive stuff to eat a relatively healthy diet. And like I said, there are tinned fish, omega-3s like mackerel, sardines. Tuna fish is relatively cheap, good source of protein.
Well, the beneficial things are usually cheap because they're not processed. So, it's a huge bag of spinach or a head of lettuce.
Nuts are great, although I have just because of the caloric density, I have trouble control. I love nuts.
Over in the UK, they're so expensive versus mainland Europe. We have to import
I can get about 200 grams of almonds for less than €3.
Oh, over here, 200 grams of almonds, you're looking at £5 or £6. It's really, really expensive.
It's unfortunately it's relatively cheap, but I admit, I love snacking on nuts, and I tend to avoid them completely, just frankly speaking, because I could easily pack away an entire package. I'm pretty good at that. Flax seeds are great too as a source of
omega-3s,
fiber. So there are a lot of things, and they're cheap as hell as well. You get 500 grams of shredded up flax seeds, and for I think €1.99 or even less.
Super.
So there are a lot of options available that don't involve spending tons of money and will contribute to your health. Now, I know there's some people that are just libertines. They don't care, but I think there's something to be said for quality of life. To my mind, is equatable to some sense to health. If you have a healthy lifestyle, if you're not feeling unwell. That's as you pointed out, that's what kind of wealth.
Oh, most certainly. And the other kind of aspect that I see is this, that what we now have in society is that, let's say, for example, I can make incredibly poor nutritional choices, often, through no fault of my own, for sure. So let's say, for example, I don't quite understand that, hey, I'm not supposed to consume vast amounts of sugar, and I do, or I'm just simply driven by that part of the brain, and I do. The cost of my poor decisions are then socialized onto everybody else. And maybe that's slightly off topic, but of course then the NHS has to foot the bill of the kind of bottom line thinking that that these companies have. So again, people have sold vast amounts of Coca-Cola. I don't drink Coca. I don't drink any fizzy drinks.
I don't drink it. I just drink water pretty much.
Same here, just water
and tea occasionally.
Sometimes I'll mix a bit of apple cider vinegar with my water just for that.
Oh, I got to try that. I haven't.
Great. Just for digestion and But again, over here we have a National Health Service and the cost of socializing. And again, I'm just going to kind of go out on a limb here to say that may also be driving why we see the poor nutritional choices, because people never have to pay out of pocket for the for
right. Yeah, because it's socialism to the taxpayer.
Exactly.
No, I definitely see that, and particularly with government healthcare schemes and systems. And a lot of these companies, especially in the States, they have lobbyists involved.
Oh yeah.
It's just you're not going to get these companies coming out and saying, "Oh, we're doing a bad thing." And so that's why it's up to the individual to take these things into account. And I think people. You can get a sense. I mean, when I was visiting my parents in Italy a couple of months ago, and I was eating all this pasta, I just felt awful.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I felt it, and you can feel it when you eat a really bad meal.
Oh yes, the loginess, the harder time concentrating, the kind of mental fog that comes in.
Yeah, you don't feel good. It's kind of obvious, and I think people have just kind of gotten used to it, and it's some sort of normal state of affairs for a lot of these people, but. It's a complex issue, but that's definitely an interesting aspect to it. The socializing, the costs of, and let's face it, entire industries have popped up because of this. Things for treating coronary problems, for cancers, for diabetes, obesity clinics. These are real things that people are making money off of.
Sure.
I mean, if we were to magically get rid of the vast majority of obesity, these people will be out of business. And from that perspective, it's a bad thing, right?
Most certainly, yes.
You want morbidly obese people to be checked into the clinic so they can have their stomachs tied up or whatever, right? And if you don't do that, then they lose profit. And so there's kind of a natural human conflict between things that just are overtly unethical. And profitability and desire to make profit.
Certainly.
I'm certainly glad I'm not the CEO or some major guy for Coca-Cola, because I would literally feel like a murderer. I think.
Sure. Well, I guess maybe I can only speak from the experience of the pharmaceutical industry and the people that I know there. I've never come across an individual in the industry who is knowingly evil, for want of a better word, who really understands that, look, these drugs, or understands, look, cancer's a metabolic issue, so as a result, these drugs can't work, and we can't win the war on cancer by developing chemotherapies for a metabolic disease. What you'll often find are people who are very, very well-meaning, but everything in our society, as you've pointed out, as things have become incredibly specialized, everything becomes compartmentalized because you understand your own area of specialization to an
and nothing else.
Exactly. So you'll get an individual who really, really understands, let's say, EGFR, the epidermal growth factor receptor, and they'll spend 40 years just doing that. And another individual who spent 40 years doing surgery on cancer patients. And what these individuals will do is that they'll come together and say, okay, well, let's make an agent that, targets the EGFR in a slightly better way, or slightly, or has a slightly lower side effect profile. And so you'll find that we make very, very kind of small incremental steps without ever addressing the big picture. So at least that's why what I see in the pharmaceutical industry. You don't find individuals who are.
But it seems to me that they're missing the interconnectedness of it all. The body is connected. I mean,
it's very reductionist. So most modern medicine is very, very reductionistic. So, for example, if you go to your healthcare professional and you say, "Hey, look, I have a headache," they will see the head as almost as a separate part of the body, and they'll say, okay, well, let me give you something that alleviates that headache, possibly in a pill form, or, they won't say, well, how are you sleeping? What are you eating? But they won't look at the body as a whole. And the pharmaceutical industry is the same.
They don't have the time sometimes.
Exactly. So the pharmaceutical industry is absolutely the same. Everything is super specialized. They actually did try to address this within oncology about 4 or 5 years ago. So in oncology or in all areas of medicine, you tend to find the big issue at the moment. So the big issue at the moment became translational medicine, because they realized there was such a huge gap between, the kind of bench to bedside, as it were. So what the scientist is doing in the lab and what the oncologist actually needs at the side of the patient. That became the big buzzword. So what you would have at the time is that every single published article would mention, translational medicine, and then, it kind of fell out of favor a little bit. But there is a recognition that we're missing the bigger picture by being overly focused. We focus on KRAS mutations in colorectal cancer, ALK mutations in lung cancer, EGFR in lung cancer, without ever addressing the issue that, hey, this isn't a disease where, of genomic instability. It's impaired energy metabolism. So again, it's.
Well, I hate to wax philosophical, but it seems to me a sort of epistemological issue in the sense that the body of knowledge available to human beings in this day and age is so vast that the concepts of a Renaissance man was 200-300 years ago far more easily achieved than it is today. I mean, today you have specialist programmers specializing in some specific programming language for some very specific purpose. You have, as you pointed out, people specialize in a very specific kind of cancer without looking at the general metabolism of cancer.
Yeah.
You have, and this is across the board, and there's actually, I've mentioned this term in German, Fachidiotie, literally subject idiocy, where you can speak of no subject other than what you're familiar with. And I think this is a bad thing. I mean, I guess I'm not trying to defend myself. I tend to be a generalist. I wouldn't call myself an expert in anything, but I'm knowledgeable about a fair amount of different things. That can be really helpful in connecting the dots.
Most certainly.
Particularly when you need to do research on your own and figure stuff out on your own.
Certainly. I mean, it's one of the few ways to connect the dots, to understand a little bit about certain things and then see where they all fit in. What I've seen these days, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, but also with the people that I hire, and is that the specialization is incredibly well rewarded. So for example, if you're a programmer and you understand one programming language, you're going to earn far more than the guy or the woman who understands 5 or 6 programming languages, but lacks
that specific expertise.
Exactly. So today it's the kind of time of the super specialist. And again, in an area such as programming, yeah, sure, it's fine. But in an area of, let's say, medicine, where people's lives are on the line, it's really, really causing a lot of issues, because again, the specialist will find, I guess, a better fitting, shoe, horse for, shoe for the horse, as opposed to kind of looking, kind of saying, okay, well, we need a better form of transportation, so it's really that generalist which hopefully will piece together. In the same way, for example, when I look at the manosphere, for me, MGTOW is such a kind of thriving area, because we're bringing together areas of knowledge that otherwise wouldn't fit together. Who would have thought, evolutionary psychology and, medicine and, just regular psychology and, economics, politics, energy metabolism, and this is forming a body of knowledge in MGTOW, and that's what's so great about it, as opposed to just to focus on, let's say,
politics, which is traditionally, in approaching issues of feminism and the like. It's just always become a sort of political economic thing. For whatever reasons, people didn't really want to dig that much deeper.
Yeah.
But piecing the puzzle together and drawing those pieces from what appears to be, at least superficially, different sources of information and areas that don't seem to converge when they actually do, when you look at the bigger picture. And that's what I think I've meant traditionally when I say, MGTOW is about knowledge.
I agree. Which is
because without piecing, whether it's the body, health, you need to be able to piece the pieces of the puzzle together, and it's really hard if you're so specialized in one thing. And I agree that super specialization tends to be really well rewarded, but when it comes to really important, the medical community has failed us. The American Heart Association has failed us.
Yes.
They're still recommending high carb, high sugar, low fat.
Well, I actually have a bit of a, I'm not too sure if I would call this hilarious, but I was at the AHA, the American Heart Association annual conference. I think it was maybe about 7 years ago now. And you had a room with, the building, and I think we had something like probably about 25 or 26,000 cardiologists there. And this has now gone down as industry legend, but a wife of one of the most famous cardiologists in the world had a heart attack and died there and then. And without all of the machines and everything, just not a single cardiologist there actually knew what to do.
Yeah, cardiology is kind of my experience with this is indirect through a family member, but my impression is that they're not. They accept the nutritional dogma of high carb, high sugar, low fat, and then they just kind of deal with the aftermath. So these arteries are blocked. What medication can we observe? Blah 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 blah. That's kind of what they do. They're not. Once again, they're dealing with symptoms and not the cause, which is metabolic primarily. Yes, certainly heart disease has a high genetic component, but everything can be epigenetically manipulated to some degree. Yeah. And so nutritional, there's an emerging field that's huge, nutrigenomics, which takes a very close look. It's vast now, the ways nutrition, micronutrients, as well as macronutrients can affect the body in positive way and negative ways as well.
For sure.
It's growing.
And the cardiologist that the average person sees isn't incentivized to offer you preventative advice. The incentive.
Oh, they're dealing with symptoms. So I got this problem. My arteries are clogged. Give me medication X. Okay, great.
Exactly. And that when they're paid on the medications that they prescribe to you. So they're paid to perform surgical operations if they're let's say a cardiothoracic surgeon or a surgical cardiologist. And if they're a clinical cardiologist, they're paid to prescribe you medicine, so they get a kickback. Massive heart disease, business is good, right? More surgeries performed. Well, it's like in oncology. A lot of people didn't realize that, and it was only stopped about a couple of years ago. But this was always a huge issue in the industry, that your oncologist received in his salary something equivalent to about 15% of the cost of your chemotherapy. And when you consider that the chemotherapy, sometimes it's maybe costing, was it 15? It was between 7 and 15%, depending on the center and depending on the state. But some of these therapies would cost the U.S. taxpayer or the health insurance company, $100,000 a year. So the incentive was to get you on chemotherapy as quickly as possible, because your doctor financially benefited, not the healthcare center. That oncologist in front of you took home money the quicker you got on chemotherapy and the more of it they gave you. And what this led to was a case where people would be given chemotherapy past the point of logic. So you have somebody with stage 4 cancer, it's very, very clear they're not going to recover. And they would still keep on handing them salvage chemotherapy, destroying the last few months of their life, because your oncology benefited financially from that process.
Yeah, it's a difficult ethical issue, and I'm not a fan of completely unrestrained capitalism because, let's face it, people don't put brakes on themselves. We see this with major companies like Coca-Cola and McDonald's. And on the other hand, I mean, I don't want to get into that. It would be too lengthy of a discussion, maybe for another time, but there's certainly in the medical community, there's some real concerns. But ultimately, it's up to us as individuals to take a kind of personal nutritional responsibility, because there's an old expression, we are what we eat. Well, that's not just true of the way we look externally, but what our blood work is like and how our organs are functioning and so on. And so I think if there's a lesson to be learned from this video, it's that one, doctor, heal thyself, and you as an individual, you can heal thyself, or rather, thou canst heal thyself, to use proper early Middle English, by taking initiative on your own and learning about this. And this is not rocket science. I'm not that smart a guy. I learned all this stuff. You can teach it to yourself as well. Maybe you don't care, but if you don't care, then you can accept the consequences of that as well.
For sure.
But don't assume that the doctor is going to be able to do a much better job than you can.
For sure. And I agree with you that there is a cost to everything. Everything you put into your body, there is a cost to it. If it's sugar, your body will respond in a very, very predictable way.
Yeah, and usually not the best way, unless you're trying to take a nap. Maybe it's good for that. It's good up that serotonin production. Anyway, guys, everyone, thanks for listening. I hope this was informative and interesting. Certainly, not every day of the year we get to talk to someone who is extremely well versed in oncology and oncogenesis, as well as cancer survivors. So I want to thank Clive for once again being here and offering his insights. And for those, I mean, by the gods, I certainly don't wish anyone develop cancer. But if you're ever in that situation, and let's hope that none of us ever is, let's think about some of the stuff that was talked about today, because it could potentially be life-saving, and your quality of life, in addition, will be preserved, as opposed to irradiating your body with poison, basically.
For sure.
Okay, so everyone, thanks for listening, and I will catch you guys soon. Take care.